Okay, we on? Oh, I see the transcription has started. So, hello everybody. My name is Melissa Kenfield. I teach sociology here, and I am super excited for this presentation. The focus will be on true crime, and just highlighting the intersections with sociological analysis along the way. So a few things that I wanted to highlight as we start. Like again, I mentioned that we'll hopefully go for about 45 minutes. If I get really into something, I might go long, but I will do my best to, cut things off early. Um, I also have this presentation. I'm going to drop a link in the chat that is a link to the presentation I'm using. And again, I checked the link. It should work for y'all. If it doesn't, let me know in the chat and I will fix it. But it has all the clickable links. So I'll talk more about that as we go. And so I'm going to cover a little bit of this, like true crime as a genre. There's been this whole series of talks, and I want to make sure that if this is the first one you've joined, you're not completely lost. But if you're watching the recording, I would say go back, watch the other ones. They're great, and then rejoin us. I need to cover a few sociological concepts. I teach sociology, so we'll talk about sociology. And then there's some of these tough questions. I feel like this has been hyped up as the semester's gone. All of these questions of like, why are people like this? What are we doing? Um, and I'm going to try my best to address some of those questions. And some of them I'll say, let's look at psychology, and some of them I'll say, I don't know, leave it to the psychology people to figure out. But there's some really interesting sociological research about the entire topic of true crime, of how it's presented in the media and how it influences us. So that's where we're going today. And the content reminder that I have for us, will put myself back in the corner on some of this. Um, so I'll be talking about some of these serious crimes, and especially there will be commentary about sexual assault and murder. So heads up on that. If you have small children around you who don't want to hear those terms yet, then again, heads up, we will go there. And like I mentioned, I'll be referencing some of the earlier presentations. So again, hopefully we'll just merge right in. But again, like I mentioned, if you're watching the video, it might do well for you to pause this one, watch the others, and come back. You probably noticed my video format already. So on some of the slides, I'm going to just do the full text on the screen so you can follow along. On others, I'll be a talking head. And the reason for that is there's some of these things that I want to be able to communicate to you, convey that this is messy, this is difficult, and there's different sides to things. So, again, hopefully y'all can see my screen on that one. Um, Now I want to pause in the chat and see, are we good? Is like my video pinned for everyone? Spotlight for everyone.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Couldn't see the full, like, your
that's
text.
okay.
So, thank
Perfect.
you.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. And thanks for letting us know that the link is working as well. And again, if you're trying to follow along on a tiny screen, then sorry about that. But that's why I've linked the companion document so you can follow along later on. I was raised on reading Rainbow. I'm like the reading Rainbow generation, which, is a pretty wide window. But one of the iconic lines from it is, "But you don't have to take my word for it." And I've really like internalized that to say that even when we have people, when we have presenters who know what they're talking about, it's still good to follow their sources, look up what they're talking about, do your homework. So in that presentation link, um, you'll see links to some of these articles I've referenced, and I encourage y'all to read the full academic research on that one. So that's the heads up on that one. So true crime, we've been talking about this throughout the semester. Um, and it's this genre. It's a nonfiction genre that focuses on particular, like, actually happened stories of criminal behaviors. And it takes all kinds of forms, right? Like it can be podcasts or books, TV shows, documentaries, all of these different things. And it's a pretty broad genre, like it presents in different ways, but one of these characteristics is that, it's not just a name, date, this is what happened. It's not dry, strict presentation of facts. Like it often dramatizes, like puts you in the scene, gives you these narrative characteristics. And they all have kind of like a different bent to it, a different agenda to it. Um, but some of them, like some of the ones that I've watched, have more of this focus on like how did the system get it wrong? Where did they fail? Or why is it that outsiders can come in, like do investigations and find something that was missed? And so there's a certain element of that where it like helps the reader or the viewer or the listener like feel like they're part of the story and feel like they are empowered to like go do something on that one. So that's kind of like that genre that we're talking about. And it all references like criminal behavior. So that means we have to think about crime. So I'm going to talk a little bit about crime as a social construct. Now, sociologists love talking about social constructs. Uh, we think that everything is a social construct. And so I want to start there and say, this is what we mean by social constructs. And again, I'm trying to resist the urge to just treat this like an intro class, but we want to get to the sociology of true crime. We'll talk sociology for a minute. So when we say social constructs, we mean something that may or may not be like objectively real, but it has a ton of meaning that we've built up around it. So one of the classic examples here is the idea of continents. Most of us were raised on this like 7 continent model of like there's North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, Antarctica. But depending on where in the world you were raised, you might have been taught a 5 continent model that merged the Americas, or a 6 continent model. So there's some that merge the Americas, so that there's some that treat Europe and Asia as the same thing. And there's this underlying concept called plate tectonics. Like we know that there's tectonic plates, but they don't really match up to what we've culturally constructed continents to be, such as there's the Eurasian plate, like there's something that merges Europe and Asia. But culturally, we tend to think of Europe and Asia as being separate, mainly because of the perceived cultural differences. So we've constructed the concept of continents, and it is useful and it helps us communicate. And by that same token, crime is something that is inherently a social construct. Like we as people made up the rules. We decided what's normal behavior, what's deviant behavior. So when sociologists analyze crime, we think in terms of, well, why did we criminalize certain things? Why do we say that's not acceptable, that is acceptable? So again, people have been arguing about, what is morally right, what is good, what makes a well-structured society. They've been arguing about that for millennia. And here we come in late to the game and just trying to analyze, okay, so what do we do with that? How do we decide which things we say are wrong, which things we say are right? Um, and one of the things that we end up doing when societies construct crime is we can actually essentially create images or stereotypes of people having different behaviors. So we can construct unequal enforcement of laws. So this one, bear with me for a minute, but we're going to go to a hypothetical. Imagine we've got 2 different populations, and let's call them the Hynerians and the Sabatians. And imagine that in our hypothetical universe, they commit crimes at a similar rate. But imagine that we have a cultural stereotype that says the Sebastians are an oily, slimy people. And because of that, we have the police follow them more. They're stop and frisked more. They follow them to traffic stops more. And then because they're stopped more and searched more, they're arrested more. And then there's more criminal data. And then we have this criminal record that says, oh, Sebastians commit crimes more, are arrested more, are imprisoned more, mainly because we're not investigating the other population to the same amount. And so in that way, we have constructed crime. We have created crime and created a disparity based on stereotypes. So those are some of the things that sociologists keep in mind as we're thinking about crime data. Another way that we construct this is in our popular imaginations. So a lot of people don't have much firsthand experience with the criminal justice system. Our images of the criminal justice system are given to us through our popular media. Like, what do we see on TV? What do we see on the news? What do we see in fictional accounts? What do we see in these things that portray themselves as true crime? So that's socialization in a nutshell as well. So when we think about crime, we've constructed what it means in our society. And this is a place where, again, I always welcome drop comments in the chat, helps me to know that I'm connecting with y'all in a meaningful way. But like when you picture crime, when you think of the word crime, what type of images come to mind? And when you think of media portrayals, what do we often highlight? So I'll take a coffee pause for a minute if anybody wants to jump in the chat of what crime means to them. When I think about crime, and I did the low low effort Google image search, what is the Google Images image of crime? Well, it's these dramatic crime scenes. Like most of the images were crime scene tape, and most of them had these little like the evidence marker things of, oh, we're gonna like pick up a bullet case, we're gonna pick up everything we can find there. And so the popular image of crime, we often think of, again, the sensationalist, the murders, violent assaults, violent robberies, sexual assaults, things like that. But when you look at the actual data, that's not what most crime is, and that's not why most people are imprisoned. So again, without getting into the weeds of crime data, there is this problem we have that there's a huge disconnect between what is reported to the police and what people actually experience. So there's these two main data sources. There's either, the uniform crime reports that most police departments report to the FBI and then it gets compiled, um, or there's the crime victimization surveys, which, you can talk about crimes that you've experienced or if you know a family member, but murder will not be reported very well on victimization surveys because generally in the case of a murder, the victim has been killed. So that's one of these, like, there's a data problem, but the best we've got, I've provided a resource here, a link to the Pew data, where they compiled some of this. And overwhelming, like the most common crime in the FBI data is some form of larceny or theft, like something was stolen, something was shoplifted. And that's not what most of our true crime or news coverage is really talking about. Like that's not the most common crime that people talked about. And again, I'm going to drop the presentation link in the chat one more time for the people who might have come in more recently. But um, again, like that, we don't talk about that as much. We don't talk about motor vehicle theft as much. So we're going to just kind of put a pin in that, like think about that. We'll get back to it and weave that thread in a few minutes. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this data doesn't calculate or doesn't count drug offenses, in part because they are treated so differently based on what state you're in, or even within the state, which city or county you're in. So a few more things to keep in mind here is like there's this concept called victimless crimes, which can also be thought of as crimes against society or public order offenses. So things like most drug offenses, gambling, prostitution, there's not a direct victim most of the time. There's not a direct harm to another party. People involved are largely consenting, but the long-term consequences of these behaviors is ultimately generally harmful to society or the person who is engaging in this behavior. And so keep that in mind. I talked briefly about this division between property crime and violent crime. Again, most of these um, podcast accounts, these true crime accounts, are talking about the most sensationalistic, violent crime and not the bulk of what the criminal justice system deals with. So we end up kind of like overstating the dangers of violent crime when that's not, the most common thing that people experience. And so even our concepts of criminal behavior often get constructed to be like when we think about theft, when we think about larceny, it tends to be this image of more of like a lower socioeconomic status experience of like poorer people who are stealing supplies or stealing necessities of life. And our image of crime doesn't often think about things like employers underpaying their workers. So I've got a link here to the Economic Policy Institute talking about wage theft, which is when workers or when employers underpay their workers. So there was one case, there's been like ongoing lawsuits for years, but some of these cases have been settled within the past couple of years. But there was a big deal about particularly Amazon workers. Amazon was forcing people to clock out and then stand in line and then go through a security check. And it would be 5, 10, 15 minutes of waiting. And you add that up over all of these different workers, add that up over just the chunk of time that people work there. And Amazon was essentially like keeping people at work on the premises for just thousands of hours more than they were paying them for. So that is a form of theft, a form of stolen time, but it's not part of our like popular image of what crime is. So that's again, that's a big area of crime that we don't visualize quite the same way. And then white collar crime again continues to be a major issue. And every few years there's a major scandal, and every few years we think there's going to be some sort of change. But this one is interesting because you do get some coverage of this in the true crime genre. I know that there was coverage of the Sacklers and opioid issues. There's been a ton of coverage about the Enron scandal from what, 20 years ago. And again, if you have other examples of times that white collar crime was covered in the true crime genre, please dump it in the chat, add to my viewing list and listening list. But again, for the most part, that's not what we think about when we think about crime. So that's one of these things, just to highlight when we think about true crime as a genre, we have to ask, like, is it actually telling us the truth? Is it telling us the truth about crime? And again, the answer is sort of. Like when we zoom in on a particular serial killer or a particular scandal, you are largely getting factual information. You are largely getting a factual presentation, but you're not getting the truth about crime as a concept. And that's like generally fine. We'll get back to that with the what could go wrong at the very end of this. But again, it's interesting to think about how does that impact how we understand the policing system, how we understand the world around us. And that's where, call back to the presentation about the gap between CSI and reality. The screen is cut off. I don't know which way I'm cut off. If y'all could help me figure out what part of me is missing, let me know. Um, I intentionally like put the text to the very side because I knew I'd be in the way. But on that presentation between the gap between CSI and reality, um, there's actually a lot of really interesting academic research. I put the term in here. And if you go to our library databases, we'll pop over there for a second. If you search there for the CSI effect, you'll come up with a ton of interesting articles talking about this gap and how it influences people's interpretation, like how it influences their roles on juries, how it influences how they understand the justice system broadly. So again, you don't have to take my word for it. Go read in the library databases, a ton of interesting things. Oh yeah, my hand just like cuts off into the nether here. Like that's just fun. Um, yeah. So I don't have, the space on this one to review all the literature on the CSI effect, mainly because that's largely fiction. Um, I will cover more of like how true crime in particular impacts us. And yes, it does seem that there's an impact on how people understand actual data and evidence, even in a fictionalized environment. So the true crime impact should probably be even bigger. So social stratification in a nutshell. This is another thing that's just going to fly by really quickly, but in every society, you're going to have these like preferenced categories of like who has the political power, who has money, who has access to particular things, and it varies by the society. Not every society has the same preferenced category. And when sociologists talk about this, we're we're analyzing these disparities or these differences. And I want to be careful about saying that the differences alone are interesting enough to study. Like we don't have to assume negative intentions on everything. The outcomes alone are interesting enough to study. So that that might help. Okay, so on to the media analysis. The first presentation, The Rise of True Crime as Infotainment, that covered this part really well. So I'm not going to dwell here for a long time, but I did want to refresh our memories. That one of the things to keep in mind that in our media environment, um, again, what we get shared in popular media is not representative of reality. We know that, but sometimes we don't like know that. That the stories that rise to the top, they're something that we're interested in, but they don't necessarily represent the totality of the crime environment. And so some of it is in the United States, for example, our population, like at the national level, is about like 60% non-Hispanic white, 20-ish% Hispanic, and then about 13% Black and about 6% Asian. And so that means that numerically the white viewership is still the largest population. And so there is a media incentive to cater to the interests of the largest population. And so that's one of those, like, that is simply a how uh, how the media environment works kind of issue, and we don't have to necessarily infer a negative intent there, but it's just like built in, it is baked into the system. They're not trying to be systematic studies of crime, and so as much as I might complain about the disparities there, they are like, that's not what true crime as a genre is trying to do. There's this thing like what social forces are shaping the decisions of what we cover. There's the entire like algorithmic environment that we live in, how much these content producers, and especially Netflix is like the paragon of this. Netflix would use a massive amount of data on which shows, like when people subscribe, what are the first shows they watch, and as they're watching shows, when are they pausing mid-episode, what's going on, what does it take to like have the best cliffhanger so that people watch the next episode. And so they've got this big data, these analytics on how to get people to like stay on the platform. So again, their goals there are get people interested, not represent truth. And then there's just kind of this like observation effect. Like we get the cyclical pattern that you see these stories that focus on white perpetrators, white victims, people are watching it, they get more clicks, and so people just keep creating that same type of content. So there's again all of these kind of things um, that shape what gets covered. Now, I've covered a lot of the backstory. I did want to spend some time talking specifically about things we find in the academic research, things we find in sociological research in particular. You'll notice that I will also pull from related fields like social psychology, criminology. There's a few times I'm using resources from media and communications because it just kind of rounds it out. Um, but one of the things I just love about sociological research is like we have so many different cultural beliefs. And a lot of times they're based on our observations, they're based on what we think we've seen. But the question becomes, does the data actually back it up? And so on some of these articles I'm going to talk about, you'll look at them and say, well, duh, like obviously. But now we get to say, oh, the research actually backed up our beliefs. It's not just a cultural myth. Um, and then sometimes we look at research and find, oh, it doesn't match our cultural myths, or it helps us to understand this gap between political mythology, cultural ideology, and reality. So one of these pieces of criminology research, I'm not providing the link on this one, but just kind of like off the top of my head, an example of ways that sociological research helps us to sort out what reality is. There's all of these discussions of like what makes a person cause crime. Like, was it what type of childhood trauma, or what type of underfunded school system, or what type of neighborhood, or are some people just bad? Like, what do we do about that? And there was one researcher who studied in particular people who had been imprisoned in Louisiana who were released from prison after Hurricane Katrina wrecked New Orleans. And he studied the gap between people who could return to where they were from and people who could no longer return to where they were from and had to move to a different parish, because Louisiana has parishes instead of counties. And so the thought is, if crime is just entirely about me and my choices, then you wouldn't see any gap between recidivism or the return to crime. You would see like, oh, people are just committing crimes because they want to. But what the researchers found is that the people who couldn't go back to their county of origin, to the parish of origin, they were less likely to commit crime again than the people who went to their home. And so it's pointing to this research on crime is not just about me and my individual choices. Crime is also about my environment. And it's like backed up by data now. And again, a lot of y'all might be saying, well, obviously we knew that. But again, the point is research has backed that up with evidence. So I'm going to go into the weeds on some of these. And again, I'll get myself out of the way on these. And again, if you want to follow along with the presentation, I will keep reposting it in the chat to my heart's desire. So one of these things, this is focusing specifically on TV news, but they did a study on national news coverage from the time frame was the early 2000s. This was a study from 2010, and they were focusing on how does the TV news match reality in terms of who's portrayed as a criminal, who's portrayed as a lawbreaker, and who's portrayed as a victim compared to the actual crime data from the regions that were being covered. And they explained why. The article says, if the media is overrepresenting certain groups, especially males and people of color, as perpetrators, this may promote racial or gender stereotypes or reinforce public hostility. On the other hand, overrepresentation of the victimization of certain groups, such as whites or females, may promote misleading views of what populations are the most vulnerable to crime or who should fear crime. And so they looked at news coverage from this, and to sum up all of the data that they sorted through, they found that in news coverage that the white population was being slightly underrepresented as lawbreakers proportional to the crime data, and that the Black offenders were being slightly overrepresented, but TV news was still largely covering white criminals, white victims, because that was numerically the largest group. And they had this particular quote. So they looked at the offenders and they looked at the victims. They noticed that stories were less likely to depict Blacks than whites as victims. Again, compared to the actual crime data, that the Black population was underrepresented as victims. And so it promoted this worldview of white people being victimized at a higher rate, even though that wasn't the actual data on this one. So if you're interested in that one, go ahead, read more. I've provided the links to all of these in the document. Now I'm going to point to another piece of research, and this is shifting more into true crime specifically and why people are pursuing this. Like, why do we love this genre? So this is another study from 2010. This one was put together in a really interesting way, where they basically gave people options of which book would you rather read? And they're trying to understand, where is this coming from? So I've got this quote at the top commenting the theory underneath it, that it seemed to be drawing from this survival strategy. So they say evolved survival strategies include not only the propensity for people to commit murder, but also people's obsession with murder. So they're explaining this, that there seems to be something wired into people that, as a way of protecting ourselves, as a way of promoting survival, they use this term fitness relevant information, and that's a specific technical term meaning like a biological drive towards reproductive survival, that people have developed tendencies or ways of protecting themselves that help them survive. And it seemed that people's interest in these crime stories were a way of, at least cognitively, of a way of them thinking, oh, I can protect myself in the future by understanding this one. So they did this study where they offered people options. Which book would you rather read? And they did a variety. So they had these titles like Violence in Paradise, a true account of murders that shocked Hawaii, or Dangers of War, a true story of an army unit serving in the Gulf War. And they offered these up as, which book would you rather read? And they found that women were far more interested in these true crime stories than men were. Um, that men were more interested in the story about the army unit serving in the Gulf War than the women were. And then that comparison of Violence in Paradise about murders in Hawaii, or Dangerous, the true story of LA gang members. Men were slightly more interested in the murders in Hawaii than LA gang members, but women, again, overwhelmingly wanted to read about the true crime story about Hawaii. So there's this thing like women are more into this than men are. And then they're trying to figure out what is it specifically. So they offered up a few different summaries of the books. And again, think for yourself on this one. Which book do you think people were more drawn to? One that mentioned that a victim of a hiker escaped, or one that mentioned this hiker escaped due to a clever trick she learned on the internet? And I think most of us would be interested in what is this clever trick? So this is kind of a marketing thing too, of uh, people were drawn to this because they wanted to know, is this clever trick useful? What is this trick? Will it actually save my life? So there seemed to be something about the usability, the application of true crime stories that they were interested in. And they did that comparing men to women. And again, men were slightly more interested in finding about the clever trick. Women overwhelmingly are like, oh, I want that book. And they did the same kind of experiment, asking about which one would you rather read, this book that just talks about this murderer, or one that asks about the motives. And the men were like, yeah, they both sound good. And the women in this study, again, overwhelmingly, the women were drawn to, I want to know what makes this person tick. So that was, again, something about understanding motives or ways of protecting ourselves are why women seem to be drawn to this genre. So that's one study. Now, spoiler alert, in academic research, sometimes research on the same topic finds different conclusions, different outcomes, and it can be a little confusing. So there was another one specifically about the podcast audience, like why are people listening to particular podcasts? And they did a survey asking, why do you listen to these things? And again, it seemed that, women were way more interested in true crime than men were. But when they were ranking their reasons, they tended to say entertainment, just something to pass the time. They didn't really say, oh, I listened to that to learn about how to protect myself. So the first study was saying people are drawn to this because they want to understand how to protect themselves. And the second one said, not so much. But again, they did find this difference between men and women, that women did acknowledge that understanding the criminal mind, they acknowledged that was in something they were into more than men did. Another big function that happened in this study is that there was this peer effect, that some women would be listening to these podcasts and then all their friends would be talking about it. So other women started listening to them too, just because their friends were talking about it. And so it kind of snowballed, where women who might not otherwise have been interested in the genre, because their friends were into it, were more likely to get into it. But because men didn't have that same draw that some women did, they just didn't have that same peer group snowball effect. So again, hopefully that helps us understand a little bit more about that one. So again, gender gap and who's into it. There's a little bit of conflicting research on how much, what is our base motivation there. But that means we need more research. So if you're really into that, please get involved in doing research. Um, so I referenced this a little bit earlier, just when it comes to how we're socialized. But why does this matter? And again, some of it is because we start to think we know what we're talking about when we might not actually know what we're talking about. So there can be some outcomes or social consequences of this disproportionate interest. And I'll get a little bit more into some of the other outcomes, but I do want to preface the next thing I'm going to be talking about specifically is mythology, like cultural myths about sexual assault and intimate partner violence. And I'll be going through kind of this series of how did newspapers cover it? What did we learn about how music videos impact our perceptions? And then I'll get specifically to how did podcasts measure up compared to these other forms of media. So that's where we're going in these next few slides. So again, get myself out of the way. So this is kind of this framework of the cultural myths. There's again a ton of research on essentially again like sexual assault mythology or rape myths that says that sexual assault tends to be like, oh, it's strangers, like this mythology of you should fear parking garages at night, you should carry a whistle, things like that. And it creates this image that sexual assault is an isolated incident or it's something that people aren't like really honest about. When the reality is, most sexual assault perpetrators are known to the victim. It often is in the context of a relationship, and there's often escalating patterns of behavior. There's this huge gap, especially when you compare victimization surveys to actual crime reports, that sexual assault is severely underreported, that a lot of people never report the assaults, and that means that a lot of the perpetrators will never be arrested or have any other engagement with the criminal justice system. Um, or these assumptions, these myths about intimate partner violence, that there's this image of, oh, if they didn't leave, they must have been okay with it, even though it's really hard to leave these relationships. So one of these things I wanted to highlight is the stories, the mythology is often, oh, it's one singular bad actor, when the research has shown that there's a complicated web of individual choices and social norms, expectations about what a healthy relationship looks like, expectations about masculinity and femininity, and how the legal system treats people, that they all cause this interlocking web. But it's really complicated, so it's hard to talk about. And then this last comparison that I put up here is there's kind of this, well, we shouldn't blame masculinity. And it's messy because the research has shown that it's not, masculinity or masculine norms inherently that are a problem, but there is a lot of research on what's called masculine discrepancy stress, that when people feel a disconnect, like they feel like they're supposed to fit certain social norms and don't, then that leads to violent negative outcomes. Um, but when people are just like, they're fine, like, oh, I don't follow the social norms and I'm fine with it and it's not stressful, then you don't see the negative outcomes. So again, that's a lot of things to unpack there. And again, I wanted to highlight that a lot of these cultural myths are useful. I'm not saying they're good, but I'm saying they're useful, not just to help abusers hide their behavior, but these cognitive myths about sexual assault and intimate partner violence and crime broadly helps our brains to feel safer. So this is where we're veering into the social psychology, ask a psychologist or a counselor for a lot more of how this all works. But this phenomena of victim blaming, like saying, oh, this person was like asking it for it because of how they were dressed, or it was his fault he was abused because he did this, that it helps protect the others, protects us from living in uncertainty. So it's basically a lie that we tell ourselves, but then it increases harm to the abused. But again, imagine how that emotionally affects people to think, oh, the person most likely to abuse me is my intimate partner, the person I love. Like that's really hard. That's hard to process. And so our brains, create this distance. We have these meaning making devices and often create meanings where there wasn't any. This is also like the root of a lot of stereotypes, that our brains start drawing connections when there wasn't a connection. And again, it's often just like our brains do that. We're not conscious about it. It's just what our brains do. And only through learning a lot about ourselves, like through a lot of reading psychology research, through counseling, through all of these things, we start to understand how these defense mechanisms work. And a lot of times it's like the smoke alarm that's too sensitive. You don't want to like just unplug your smoke alarm, but you also don't want it going off anytime you turn on the oven. So we just kind of have to like learn, how do we be aware of which beliefs do we have, where do they come from? We also see this like at a bigger picture, like cultural phenomena of particular beliefs. When things are really hard to understand, when things are really hard to believe, we often create other meanings, and especially conspiracy theories. So it's things like there were so many conspiracies, there are still conspiracies about the JFK assassination. Um, and some of it is like it was such a politically disruptive event that there must have been more. It must have been a cover up, instead of saying, oh, it was the person who shot JFK. But when you look at things like attempted assassinations that were not successful, like the shooting of Reagan, um, what's the conspiracy theory besides Hinckley? Like we took his explanation at face value. So that's one of those things. Another example here is that as the COVID crisis was starting, so many people leapt to assumptions, leapt to conclusions about, specifically there was the theory of like it must have been a lab leak that was based on no evidence at the time. And now I'm not speaking to the truth claim, like as a scientific framework says, as new evidence comes out, I need to update my beliefs. What I'm talking about is people jumping to conspiracies and saying it must have been based on no evidence. Because again, the alternative is acknowledging or believing that we live in a fragile environment and that viruses can evolve in the wild that can kill off significant portions of a population. That's unsettling. Like, I don't like having to live in that world. And yet it seems that's what the evidence points to. But our brains don't like that, and so a lot of times we'll jump to these other explanations to say it must have been something more. So again, these things, these myths, beliefs can be useful, but not necessarily true or good. So all of that to go back to talking about sexual assault, and some of the research on that one. Uh, a study of newspapers in the early 2000s looked at how the media narratives constructed stories of sexual assaults. And the stories often focused either on how the women were like provoking or escalating situations, or they were a victim, like a lone heroine fighting a lone villain. And so the media narratives seem to focus on those stories instead of any of the bigger picture. And so this article specifically highlights the framing of it being an episodic, individual, rather than connected to a social environment, even though the research at the time and still points to it seems to be a bigger picture, complex web of interlocking topics. They also noticed that the stories in newspapers at the time rarely included resources. And this is something I've definitely seen a change on in the past couple of decades, that there's now going to be more likely that you see some kind of like public service statement of, if you are in this type of relationship, here's where you call. But at the time, the stories mainly just kind of left it as, okay, the victim still needs to be responsible for finding a solution. And the last thing I wanted to highlight on this one is the newspaper coverage tended to underreport the role of alcohol, which is messy because you don't want to just say like, oh, the perpetrator wasn't responsible because there was alcohol involved, but it does, again, warp our understanding of what is a dangerous situation. It makes it harder for people who are victims of the same behaviors to relate or understand the role of alcohol in such situations. So that's one study, super interesting, plenty to read on that one. Another one, this one, again, super juicy study here. They were looking specifically at music videos and how that impacted people's perceptions of healthy behaviors in relationships. And so they picked two different music videos, both of which had lyrical content that related to domestic violence. One of them was Love the Way You Lie by Eminem featuring Rihanna, and the other was Florence and the Machine's debut single, Kiss with a Fist, which it's kind of this happy pop dance, and the music video has some comedic things to it, like they break plates over a guy's head, but he doesn't respond, so it kind of looked like just comedy prop. And so it's kind of like a confusing image. But in the Eminem music video, you're following a narrative of a couple who's fighting and they are physically violent with each other. And there's just these really dramatic scenes, like he punches a hole in a wall, and next thing you know, they're passionately kissing again, and the hole in the wall is still right there. So he's showing like violent, abusive behavior, and she's fine with it and seems to still be like reasonably happy in the relationship. And so, that's kind of a red flag for a relationship. So they did this study and they asked specific things from a list of like, which do you view as not abusive or extremely abusive? And it's things like telling you that he or she will kill himself or herself if you ever leave, or cutting or burning or harming themselves in front of you. And then they showed people these music videos, and they found that the people who were like watching this narrative music video seemed to minimize the red flags of abusive behavior. Yeah, and it's not just the music. So they swapped it. They showed the Florence and the Machine music video that again was like kind of comedic, and played the Eminem song, and people just didn't have the same response to it. And they showed like they mixed and matched all of them. They played the Florence and the Machine song to the Eminem music video, and they found that it really was the pairing of that music and the song that would like transport people into the scene, and they just wouldn't take domestic abuse as seriously after watching and enjoying that visual perception of it. So, our media does impact how we understand the world around us. And again, it did seem to be tied to the visuals in particular, not just listening to it on the radio. So now we'll be back on the podcasts for a minute. Um, this is another study on how stories were presented in the podcast. And I'm noticing that I'm running out of time on this one because, like I said, I got really excited talking about it and talked too long on some of the other pieces. But intimate partner violence and media portrayal in the podcast environment, they were pleasantly surprised that in the podcast, they largely matched reality describing patterns of behavior. They weren't treating these stories of abuse as isolated, episodic incidents, but they were actually explaining the levels of use of threats and the levels of emotional abuse, which is often underrepresented in other forms of media. And so they quoted one of the articles I mentioned earlier, that women often consume these media to learn the warning signs. And so maybe podcasts more realistic portrayals, that maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's an important teaching tool. Another thing that they highlighted in this one is the particular types of violence that get emphasized in these media portrayals are particularly things like strangling and bruising, and that bruising in particular seemed to be something that was highlighted as, oh, that's how you know a person was really abused. And they pointed out that's a bit of a problem because there's plenty of emotional and physical abuse that does not leave bruises or leave outside marks. And so do be careful about thinking too much about, oh, you have to have a bruise to be abused. So we've covered a lot of different things on that. And again, my hope is you're interested in some of those articles and you go read more of the research. But again, to try to tie all of this together, the media does have an impact on how we understand the world around us. And as has been noted in the chat, has been noticed in some of these articles, the podcast environment is fairly new. And so the research is just now coming out on how does this actually impact how people are responding, how people are making sense of the world around them. But one of the things I wanted to leave us on is I've mainly not even mentioned the racial issues embedded in any of this. Again, the true crime ecosystem tends to be focused on what's the population that's like numerically largest and can't afford to buy things. And so it tends to be focusing on like more affluent, mainly white perpetrators, mainly white victims. And there's a bit of a problem here. And so, yeah, there's a fantastic article. Go read that one, focusing on, again, what could go wrong? What have we not covered? um, yeah, right, like you could spend, like, legitimately, there's so much research you can do just listening to podcasts and publishing articles about that. Like, is that not a dream job for some of us? But a lot of these stories are focusing on white victims, white perpetrators, and kind of like treating the criminal justice system as racially neutral, which, again, spoiler alert, it's not. um, and so this article is pointing out that, historically there's been this genre known as like danger narratives that frames white women as the potential victims and men, especially dark-skinned men, as the attackers. And so you can find so much out there about this genre of danger narrative, everything from like World War II propaganda that painted the Japanese as like some kind of like dangerous dark-skinned other race, attacking white women, to so much of propaganda out of the American South throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And true crime's not that, right? Like, they're not this hyper racialized thing. But I'm going to read a particular quote from this article, that because of the way that true crime focuses on punishment, they make this message: in order for justice to be done, the perpetrator of these crimes must be caught and incarcerated or killed. And because most true narratives focus on white men harming white women and are thus calling for the punishment of white men, the racial implications of celebrating prisons and death chambers is muted or ignored. So she goes on to say, true crime stories don't encourage fear of people of color, but they encourage fear of crime. True crime stories don't frame men of color as the sources of danger for white women, but they center the white women as the endangered. And they don't advocate for violence against people of color, but they advocate for the institutions that commit such violence. And so that's the thing to keep in mind here, is that when we try to create like a racially neutral, oh, let's just like look at the police, look at these institutions, they're not telling a fully truthful narrative of the justice system. And so, again, that's part of this challenge that we have, is like, if you're watching a fictionalized thing like Blue Bloods or Law and Order, like, it's propaganda, that it's skewed in particular ways, but you also know it's fiction. But we also know that fiction influences how we understand the world. So when things are framed as truthful, we have an even messier thing to disentangle of, like, how does this influence how I understand the justice system broadly? So again, that's a big thing to just drop on y'all right before the end, but that's why you go read that article. Which side is it on? So that's kind of like, that's our summary. That's where we're wrapping up. And I'm going to check the chat if there were any other interesting questions. Yeah. So yeah, true crime is a really interesting genre, and has been highlighted throughout this series. It's a it's a fun thing, but it shouldn't be our main diet. Um, I like the imagery. I think it was in the first one where y'all talked about how it's kind of like dessert. It's like something that's fun. Um, and we kind of have, again, this problem of how do you tell the difference between this is reality and what's fiction? Like, when I watch Star Trek, I don't think it's going to actually teach me anything meaningful about physics. But when I watch these like closer to reality shows, I have to be a lot more intentional about what I believe. Yes, treat it like cake. Um, and it is interesting. I appreciate the comment in the chat that some of these are bringing awareness to injustices, things that were missed by the criminal justice system. And so that's kind of a important thing for us to acknowledge. And it will be interesting to see which of these lead to systemic change, like which ones actually influence how we treat the criminal justice system broadly. So that's all I've got. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in with comments, feedback. Cake. Okay,
Thank you,
so yeah.
Melissa. You did such a great job. I'm sorry I missed the beginning.
Well, good thing it's recorded.
Yeah, Teams is being fun today. But I
Yeah,
have put the credit link in the chat, so if any students are here for credit, please make sure that you fill that
yeah,
out.
yep. And I'm just gonna keep reposting my my slides link because, again, reading Rainbow Nerd, you don't have to take my word for it. Go read these articles. It's super interesting what's out there. Thank y'all so much for your participation. I love the comments in the chat.
One more thing for students. Over the summer, we will be designing our next webinar series for the fall. So if you have a topic you would like to see, please put that in the form so that we can begin putting that together for you. Thanks.